Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. In today's bonus author interview, I sit down with historian Mark William Jones, and we discuss his most recent book, 1923, The Crisis of German Democracy in the Year of Hitler's Putsch. Now, we talk about a lot in this interview, and I think it's one of the more favorite interviews that I've done in a long time because historian Jones gives us such a great perspective on these really complicated events. It's a wonderful book. The link's in the show notes. I hope you pick it up, but I'm going to be honest with you, especially speaking right now as I am in early August 2023. There's somewhat of a distant mirror aspect to this book. It's been 100 years since this time. And I think reflection can be a good thing. And as democracies around the world deal with different internal and external pressures, it's important to remember that democracy requires constant vigilance in order to be successful and constant reform and rebirth when facing new challenges. That's one of the lessons of the ultimate failure of the Weimar Republic in Germany by the year 1933. But this book is more interesting because it talks about Hitler's failed attempt, and a failed attempt that almost results in his death 10 years before his ultimate success. Now, again, the link is in the show notes. Please check it out if you're interested. I've also got links there to Western Civ 2.0 free trial, as well as there's now a free trial of just the paid Patreon feed. If you want to test it and see all the different bonus things that you can get a free trial for 7 days, and there's plenty there to keep you occupied for 7 days. So feel free to give that a try. Both the links are there. The link to buy the books is there. And so without further ado, let's start the interview. All right, well, welcome back. As I mentioned moments ago, I'm sitting down with historian Mark William Jones here, and we're talking about his most recent book, 1923, The Crisis of German Democracy in the Year of Hitler's Putsch. It's a fascinating book, and it's well done. And I think most American audiences who are listening to this, and of course everyone across the globe, you know the name Hitler. At least I would imagine that you do. And in Hitler, and we can get into this a little bit, he's kind of held up to this. He's held up in at least United States schools oftentimes as this, both a boogeyman and sort of an ultimate historical archetype in that, if you treat any dictator like this is the way that the script will play out. Full stop, no exceptions whatsoever. And, I want to get into that a little bit more, but I always kind of look in a historical book, or I suppose any book, to see what the initial hook is. There's got to be a hook in the beginning that kind of gets the story going and gets the reader engaged. And I love the hook in this book because it's only a couple pages in when you reveal that Adolf Hitler almost dies in 1923, long before his final rise to power, and the historical fallout from what could have happened from that is, of course, tremendous. So I was hoping we could start out by talking about that a little bit. How close did he come? And then also later on in the book, you write that 1923 becomes his breakout year. And I'm interested to know, how he goes from a sort of near-death experience to, a breakthrough experience.
Great, thanks for the questions, and hello to all the listeners. I think the 20th century can be thought of as being Hitler's century. I think that's why he held such a fascination over audiences in the world, in the United States and in the UK and elsewhere. Memories of the sacrifices Americans, Britons, and Liberal coalition made to defeat Hitler in the Second World War is a part of the cultural memory of the world and of everyone in the English-speaking world. And so Hitler then is this kind of bogeyman who is, more threatening, more dangerous, more evil than the other evil leaders or enemies of liberal democracy that have risen to be at the apex or head of totalitarian movements. So Hitler has that place in our memory, and nobody has ever heard of von Schäuble-Richter, who's walking alongside Hitler in November 1923, on the 9th of November. And it's the first time that Hitler tries to use force to seize power and to become the leader of Germany. Nobody's heard of the man walking beside him. Nobody knows his name. And the reason for that is because when the Putsch begins, they are marching through Munich, and their goal is to try to get to the military command in Munich. And there's about 2,000 Nazis following Hitler, and at the front, the leaders are marching arm in arm. And this is something demonstrators would have done, but left-wing and right-wing demonstrators would have done at this time, because they link arms. That makes it much harder for a police baton charge to break up the march. And the march itself is taking place, about 20 hours after Hitler has proclaimed that he's going to march on Berlin, and that the Putsch attempt in Munich will either end with a new Germany with him as leader, or we will all die. That is his pitch to his followers the night before. And in those 20 hours, things haven't gone the way he wants. He's lost support. He hasn't got the allies that he was expecting to get. Conservative forces in Munich that have a similar agenda to Hitler but are not part of his movement have abandoned him. And so the actual Putsch morning, the march, is happening as a last attempt by the Nazi leader to try and seize power in Munich, from where he hopes to seize power, launch a march to seize power in Berlin, in the German capital, a couple of hundred kilometers to the north. And one of the things they're hoping for is that when they encounter police and army and crowds in the streets, they're hoping that people will join with them. So in other words, the march is to start. It starts with 2,000. It's hoping to have a kind of snowball effect and to become bigger and bigger and to gain more and more supporters, so that by the time it reaches its end goal, the military headquarters, the march itself will be so big that people won't stand in the way of them, and B, the army itself will have sided with the putschists. And so, when they first encounter a group of soldiers and police who are sent to stop them marching through Berlin, the first instance, this happens on a bridge near the centre of Munich, and the commander, he probably has enough military power at his disposal to open fire on the putschists and to defeat the Hitler Putsch at that point in time. But the first officer who encounters doesn't do this. He lets his men kind of stand down, and they're symbolically disarmed, and then they continue on into the centre to a square at something called the Field Hall. So it's a monument to Bavarian and military glory from the 19th century, and here they come up against a stronger group of police and army who are opposing the putschists. And Hitler's hope at this point, as he faces up to them, is that they will join his side, and they don't do that. And what follows then is that shots are fired. Who fired the first shot is one of those questions nobody can say with absolute certainty. And what we can say with certainty is once the shots are fired, Hitler and his supporters are quickly defeated. That they flee the square, and so about maybe 1 to 2 minutes after the first shot is fired, there are no Nazis left on the square other than dead Nazis, and those were the men at a group of men at the front of the Putsch, including von Schäuble-Richter, who had linked arms with Hitler at the very, very front. So the only people ahead of Hitler at this point in time in leading the march are the Flagbearers. And so the flag is something really important for any political demonstration, particularly for right-wing nationalist demonstrations. Carrying the flag, and it really matters that the flag is at the front. They march behind the flag, and so there's only a few flag bearers ahead of Hitler. One of them is killed in this moment on the 9th of November, and this later becomes really important for Nazi memory of where the Nazi movement came from in the 1930s, because they argue that the flag that he was carrying fell on his body and then got soaked up the blood of one of the first Nazi martyrs, and that becomes very much a religious relic in the 1930s. And if you've ever seen Leni Riefenstahl's film, The Triumph of the Will, there's a scene in that film where tens of thousands of people at the Nuremberg rally in 1934 watch as that flag, or a flag the organisers of the event claim was that flag in 1923, is touched by other Nazi parties, branches, local flags. And so that is really, later becomes part of the myth and the importance of 1923 as a founding moment for the Nazi movement in the Third Reich. But to come back to your question, how close did Hitler come to being killed? Literally inches, because if the bullet that was fired that took out Scheubner Richter had gone a few inches in the other direction, it would have taken out Adolf Hitler. Those men are so close together that when von Scheubner Richter is shot and falls to the ground, he drags Hitler down with him, and Hitler dislocates his shoulder in the process. So it's an uncomfortable experience for the man who later becomes the leader of the Third Reich. At this time, he's 34 years old, and he's lying on that square. His Putsch has been defeated, and he's a dislocated shoulder. He escapes the square. He gets taken away by a doctor who's a Nazi sympathizer, and he's in hiding for a small number of days, and he is then arrested because at that point his movement has failed, and I don't want to say he's Germany's most wanted, because that would give the impression that there's no sympathy for him in Bavaria and in Munich, but he's certainly one of the most wanted people in Germany at that time. Now, to come back to thinking about, 1923 should, if we remember Hitler based on everything I've said up to now, we should remember it as being a great failure for him. So how can I say that this is also Hitler's breakthrough year? And the answer to that is it's connected to the chronology, because in November 1923, when Hitler attempts to seize power, he attempts to become a German Mussolini. That's the end point of 11 months of growth and success for Hitler. Now, that line of growth from January to November hasn't been perfect. He's had some failures along the way that I'm sure we can talk about in a few minutes. But the important point is to remember that at Christmas 1922, Hitler has about 8,000 followers in his Nazi party. On the eve of the Putsch in November, he has about 50,000. Now, that doesn't mean he's the leader of a really, really large national political movement. The Social Democratic Party at this time in Germany, which is the party of liberal democracy, it has more than 1 million members. The trade union movement, most of which is supporting Weimar Germany and liberal constitutional democracy, has several million members at this time. So the 50,000 in the Nazis is still small relative to the largest political groups that are in existence in Germany, but it's the growth from January to November that has transformed Hitler from being a radical figure on the fringes to being somebody who people recognize has momentum and has talent and has an ability to draw disgruntled and unhappy Germans behind his message, to rally to his flag, and he's somebody who's having success. And in that sense, I think it's right to call it Hitler's breakthrough year, because, in late 1922, Hitler's not a nobody, but he's not a really important figure either. By the end of 1923, at the end of his Putsch, he has a name. He's become something. Now, he's a bit discredited because the Putsch has failed, but he's become a political figure of significance. And one of the ways I try and tell this story most simply is, in late 1922, in the autumn, there's a crisis in Bavarian politics. So Germany in the Weimar Republic is like the United States today. It's a federal political system. And so Berlin is like, the government in Berlin is like the government in Washington, and then the government in Bavaria is like the government of a US state, the local state government. And there's a crisis in Bavaria, the state of Bavaria. And in the parliament, somebody says, the way we'll solve this crisis is we'll make Adolf Hitler become the next prime minister of Bavaria. And everybody in the parliament, most of whom don't like the Weimar Republic, they all laugh because they don't take Hitler seriously at this point. They think that's a bit of a jokish, he's a bit of a jokish figure. He's 34 years old. He's not known for having a strong work ethic. He's known for talking in bars and cafes around Munich. He's known for giving speeches. He's known for being a hothead. So it'd be a bit like somebody saying at a political in a legislative assembly in the United States today, we'll make a shock radio jockey or TV presenter the next prime minister, and people just laugh. They don't take it seriously. But by November the following year, 12 months later, the idea that Hitler could become the leader of Bavaria is an idea that people take seriously, both his supporters, including those who are willing to follow him into gunfire on the 8th and 9th of November, and those who are who support him not actively but have share his goals but don't want to march behind him in the streets, they are starting to think of Hitler as being a strong man who can solve what they consider to be the crisis of the weaknesses of liberal democracy.
Yeah, there's a couple of things going on here that I think are really important. Again, kind of getting back to the narrative of how this period in time, especially in Germany, is often portrayed and taught, at least in the United States. I think it's important to note, that there were Germans, many, who were in opposition to Hitler and Hitler's movement, especially early on. And this example that we kind of start out with, where Hitler makes this attempt, this putsch, he's stopped physically, and he comes inches away from dying, and I think, or at least being shot. I suppose that's probably a little bit too speculative, but that matters because it muddies the water of this narrative, so that sometimes is espoused that, the Germans didn't do anything. They didn't do anything to stop him. And, by consistently appeasing him in these different ways, these are these problems. So you have to stamp it out. The other thing that I think is important to recognize are the numbers. As you say, yes, he grows from 8,000 to 50,000, but 50,000 is still relatively small. I mean, there's no reason to suspect at this point, even though his growth has been somewhat spectacular, that that's going to continue, and that he's going to rise to the level that he is. So we do sometimes, I think, a lot. I mean, with history, we always do it. It's this Monday morning quarterbacking stuff where it's really easy to be critical of people in the past of what they could have and should have done, but that's easy because we know what happens next. And people back then don't necessarily know what was going to happen next, and certainly weren't in a position to know with the certainty that we do today. So it's a different sort of scenario. So I always ask people to be a little patient with people from the past, because they didn't have the crystal ball that we have today. Now, it's interesting, as we sort of progress into the book, Hitler is not assassinated, in 1923, but you start out the book with a different assassination, and that's the assassination of, and I'm not a German scholar here, but I'll say Walter Ratnael, a gentleman who's killed on June the 24th, 1922. He's a foreign minister from Germany, and he's killed for a political purpose, very much in the same way that, and I think you even point this out in the book, the way that Franz Ferdinand's death 8 years earlier heralds the beginning of World War I. There's people who think that maybe this is going to have a similar consequence. And I think it's interesting because I'd never heard about this murder before, but it is important and emblematic of the time period that we're going into. So I thought you could take a couple of minutes and sort of tell us what's going on with this murder and what is the fallout and how does that differ from the expectations of those who orchestrate it in the first place?
Yeah, brilliant question. And I completely agree with you that it's really important when you think about the fate of liberal democracy in Germany after the First World War, that you don't see it as being an inevitable line from, one moment into Hitler becoming chancellor. And I think one of the worst things about a lot of history TV programs, radio programs, other podcasts, is that they have this story of the rise of the Nazis. And that's like, in the UK, I don't know if that's the case in the United States, but in the UK, that's like a whole school subject area where you have to account for and explain the rise of the Nazis. How did Hitler go from being this one man on his own to being, the head of a genocidal state at war with the Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire, and amongst others. Those are the three big forces that eventually combined to defeat him. And so I always think, we've got to move backwards and say, who was this person and what was the stage that made him, and could that stage have had other outcomes on it rather than the outcome of Hitler becoming chancellor? So we've got to bring contingency back. And that's both really important for our work as historians and thinking historically. It also makes the story, in my opinion, a little bit more scary, because when we realise that any liberal democracy can follow the same fate as Weimar Germany, we realise that there's a lot of contingency in history and how things play out, and our own stability can be swept away faster than we think. And that's one of the reasons why I opened the book with the murder of Walter Ratnael, which we've spoken about, because Ratnael is the German foreign minister in 1922. He's a really, really interesting individual. I think the first thing to say about him is he's born in the late 1860s, and his father, Emil Ratnael, meets Thomas Edison at the World Fair in Paris in the 1870s. And at that time, Ratnael's father had ran a small engineering business with about 50 employees that had failed. But he recognizes Edison, and he recognized the light bulb. He recognizes this is a new technology, this is going to transform and change everything. And at the time, a lot of other German business leaders, industrial leaders, are skeptical about the technology of the light bulb, which again, it's one of those things, let's judge historical figures on their own terms, because Werner von Siemens, who's, you go and buy some Siemens stuff today, you'll realize it's quite pricey, it's good quality. His company has been a tremendous success, but Werner von Siemens got the light bulb completely wrong in the 1870s and 1880s, because he didn't think that was the future. He thought gas lighting was the future, because at the time gas lighting was new, and gas lighting was piped through cities, and so where you have a street light today, you could have a gas lamp, and that worked. And he thought the light bulb isn't going to take on because you're going to have to build extremely expensive lighting circuits to make it work. And those circuits electric circuits, I should say, to make the light bulbs work. And those circuits are going to be too expensive, so the whole thing's not going to be worth it. Ratnael's father, Emil Ratnael, saw things the other way around, got the right to bring that technology to Germany, and effectively in the 1890s and 1900s, he brought electricity to German towns and cities, street lighting to Germany's principal cities. His father turned on the street lights on Unter den Linden, which is the most visited street in the centre of Berlin. It's the main boulevard in Berlin. So that's the family he comes from. So he's the son of somebody who's gone from being a failing business and a little bit of an absent father to being an absolutely important business figure. The company that Ratnael's father founds is called AEG. It still exists today. And Ratnael himself, although initially studied philosophy and letters and is what we today call a humanist or humanities scholar, he then later studies circuit engineering and becomes a senior manager and eventually a board member in his father's company. And during the First World War, his father's company, after his father's passed away, with Walter Ratnael on its board, makes shells for Germany. It makes more shells than any other company except one German business, and that's Krupp, the famous Krupp Steelworks, which is made more shells. But that's an extremely important contribution to Germany's effort during the First World War, to the German war effort. Ratnael himself does more than this, because Imperial Germany, one of the fascinating things about it is it's this mixture of modern and early modern or traditional. So, if you figures traditional aristocrats excluding Ratnael and not liking somebody like Ratnael, a bit like old money never likes new money. And that's the same. So like the Ratnael's looked down on in these ways. He's also looked down on because he's critical. Because Ratnael keeps pointing out Germany's not using modern industrial management to organise its war effort. So during the war, he puts himself into the public sphere as someone who's arguing we need to take on more modern management techniques to plan our economy better, to fight the war better. And in 1918, as Germany's on the brink of defeat, when General Ludendorff says, who's one of the men alongside Hitler at the leading of the Putsch in 1923, when Ludendorff says we need a ceasefire, we've lost the war, we've got to send the note to the United States asking President Wilson for peace on the basis of his 14 points, Ratnael is one of the few voices in the German public that immediately says, no, we've got to keep fighting this war. He writes an article in the 3rd of October in one of the most important German newspapers of the political elites. Without naming Ludendorff, he says, he who has lost his nerve must be replaced. So basically this businessman says, the general has lost his nerve, we've got to get rid of him, we've got to keep fighting. And what makes this all the more extraordinary is that Ratnael's family is Jewish. And so he's seen as being, an outsider. He's never fully accepted by the circles of Germany who are anti-Semitic at this time. And it's important also to remember that the numbers who are anti-Semitic and the level of anti-Semitism is constantly changing before, during and after the First World War. After 1918, it's increasing dramatically. And so that's Ratnael's background. He's, German patriot. He's done as much as he could possibly do from within his position of family influence to support Germany during the war. But when the war is lost, he recognises after 1919 that the country needs to move on and that it needs new solutions in its international relations. And one of the solutions that he comes up with in 1921, when he has a position called Minister for Reconstruction, is to cooperate with France in the rebuilding of areas of France that have been destroyed during the First World War. And Minister for Reconstruction, not many liberal democracies today have a Minister for Reconstruction, but after the First World War in Europe, the reason that ministry existed was because so much territory had been destroyed during the war itself, and the challenge was to rebuild it. And so for the French, an area the size of the Netherlands is completely in ruins because of the violence of the war that takes place in France. And so Ratnael's idea in 1921 is, we will send in German companies and we will help to rebuild the bridges, rebuild the roads, rebuild the infrastructure, and make that area fit for living and for industry again. And when you remember that Ratnael's father and his family have already done this between 1890 and 1910, they've already transformed Germany by electrifying cities. So for them to come up with a plan of how to rebuild France after in 1921 and beyond, it's not an unreasonable thing. They've got the capital in the bank, so to speak, in terms of their track record of delivering things. So they know what they're doing when they're talking about Franco-German cooperation. They're talking about German business and French business working in the same area. And all of this now today probably sounds like, well, that's not revolutionary. I mean, businesses cross borders all the time. That's why that's so obvious to us and to our world. It doesn't need to be said. But at this time, that was a revolutionary idea, because the French businesses were looking at that proposal and saying, no way, we don't want German companies coming in here. If we let German companies come in to help rebuild France, we'll lose profit. So we don't want them coming in. The British are looking at that proposal and they're saying, we don't want that to happen, because that can lead to an alignment between Paris and Berlin, a Franco-German agreement that will exclude us and we'll be left out of the decision-making table in the future. So it can become something that we can't control. So they're against it too. And so that plan fails. But the existence of that plan is really important, and that's why I've talked about it for so long just now, is because that plan is an incipient, it's a seed for what later would become the European Union. It's the same set of ideas in existence in Europe in 1921 and 1922 after the First World War that later grow into the European Union as a peace project after the Second. What happens after the First World War is that cooperation can never take place because people don't listen to men like Ratnael. People are shown a vision of what peaceful cooperation can be, and they turn their back on it and they move towards another future. And now to come back to the group that murders Ratnael in June 1922, they are mostly led by former naval officers. And they want to avenge Germany's defeat in the First World War, and they want to avenge the outbreak of the revolution in November 1918 that leads to the establishment of the German democracy in the Navy. Because it's the sailors of the Navy who are the first ones to revolt, to mutiny. And from there, their sailors' mutiny quickly snowballs in the course of just a week into becoming the revolution that ends the Kaiserreich and leads to the proclamation of a republic. And so the officers in the Navy who see their men lead this movement, they're especially angry. They have a real cause for demand for personal revenge against the Weimar Republic. And they found groups that are committed to fighting against socialists, that are called Freikorps. They're voluntary. They're military units, paramilitary units with lots of officers. There's lots of anti-Semitism in these groups. And one of those groups is led by a man called Hermann Ehrhardt, who's a former torpedo boat captain. And when the Weimar state eventually tries to disband and destroy his paramilitary group, it goes underground. And the underground organization that it creates is called the Organization Council. To be a member, you have to be sworn in. If you betray the organization according to the organization's own statutes, you'll be punished by death. And in 1921, it undertakes its first spectacular assassination. It murders Matthias Erzberger. Its members murder Matthias Erzberger, who's the man who signed the armistice in 1918. And then in 1922, its members, three young men, spectacularly murder Walter Ratnael as he's being driven from his home in western Berlin into the centre of Berlin to the German Foreign Office. And the murder is quite spectacular because Ratnael is being driven in a cabriolet with the roof down. He's smoking a cigar. He's been out quite late the night before. He's possibly hungover, actually, because he was at a party or event hosted by the American ambassador to talk about Germany's financial debt following the First World War. When that event ends, he goes to a hotel with a German businessman called Hugo Steines, who's also a politically active figure, and they stay drinking and talking until the small hours of the morning. And then, as he's collected around 10 a.m., sitting in the back of the cabriolet with the roof down, smoking his morning cigar, as his car pulls to take a bend in the road, another car races up alongside it, and the witnesses to this event include a group of builders who are who notice the event first because they hear the screeching of the car. They hear the sounds of one car driving too fast in a suburban area, and then quickly they hear the sound of gunshots, followed by the dull thud of a grenade. And because one of the assassins shot at Ratnael in the back, and the other threw a small grenade into the back of the car. And that was the assassination of the German foreign minister, the murder of the only Jew to hold the position of foreign minister in Germany's history. And for them, they were hoping that it would provoke a uprising from the communist left. They were hoping that it would provoke instability, and they were hoping that it would create a situation in which their movement that at that time was underground could come back out into the open, join forces with the German army, which they thought would sympathise with them, and that instability could lead to a situation in which they would fight for the destruction of the Republic itself, and then for a new war against the French. Because remember, their starting point is that they want to take revenge upon France for the defeat in 1918. And so that's their goal. Through using violence, by assassinating the leadership of their enemies, they want to provoke a backlash against them, and through provoking the backlash against them, they want the crisis to spiral so that they can come back and launch an even bigger assault on Weimar democracy itself. The reason they're doing that, or the reason they're following that strategy, is they know if they try to stage a putsch on their own that they will fail. And they've tried it in 1920 and failed. So 2 years later, they're trying to use a different strategy to provoke a backlash against that will end with the defeat of the Republic. Anti-Semitism is really important to them too. The fact that Ratnael is Jewish just adds to their to the reasons for why they want to murder him.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about, this is a group who tried their own putsch that didn't work, so now it's kind of, we're going to try to come around the back door a little bit and see if we can provoke something else that will happen. But you brought up this idea of, I'll say, inter-European or international cooperation in the rebuilding of parts of France that were devastated during the First World War. And I think that's a great segue into talking about the Treaty of Versailles and the French occupation of the Ruhr region, which, and let me just take a quick side, because, again, coming from it from an American perspective, I think one of the problems that we have about World War II is this intense desire to just simply say, Germany is the bad guy. Nazi Germany is the bad guy. They were the aggressive power. It was all their fault. We don't need to look any further. Full stop. End of sentence. They declared war on everyone. That's it. Nothing else happened, so on and so forth. You get a little caveat on that, oftentimes thrown out to say, wow, the Treaty of Versailles was also really rough. And maybe we should have stuck to more of Wilson's 14 points and done less of the punitive side of this, because that's what Germany, to some people, they thought they were agreeing to the 14 points, and then they got this Treaty of Versailles rammed home that was entirely different. But there's this crucial point that is just simply never brought up. In fact, I was trying to think, I don't think anyone even told me about it until I got to college. And I had taken European history courses in upper school and high school as well. So it was a surprise to me to find out that no, the French were occupying, crucial industrial portions of Germany to try to get this money back and to get repaid. And that made people very angry, and for justifiable reasons when you start to read it in your book and in others about the behavior of some of the French soldiers who were invested in this region. So this story of it's all Germany's fault. We don't have to talk about it. France didn't do anything wrong leading up to the war, and they were unjustly attacked as everybody else was, and so on and so forth. I think it's a little bit more, it's not quite as black and white as that, as we would like it to be. And again, I think it's out of this intense desire to make this into the great black and white conflict of the 20th century. And when in reality, there were a lot of components and things going on here that don't fit as neatly into those boxes. But I was really hoping that you could talk, because the part in the book about the occupation of the Ruhr region, which is so critical to this story and to the rise of Hitler and extremism in Germany based off of this German resentment of what's going on, I think is just so important to this transition and is so often ignored. So if you could just talk about that for a little bit, and if my listeners, if you come away from nothing else from today, I think this is such a critical takeaway.
Sure, that's there's so much here. I mean, I think you're right. I think one of the things about the way people in the United States, also in Britain, look at Nazi Germany. You're right. It's nice to say that's the bad regime, because that makes us the good guys. And if you go on YouTube and Google "liberation of Dachau concentration camp," you can see GIs walking. They had embedded TV recordings in the groups then that did that. You can see yourself walking along, and wouldn't be a particularly militaristic person, but it's still hard to watch one of those videos and not say, if you're going to be somebody in the 20th century, that's a good person to be, liberating a concentration camp in the uniform of the United States. And that makes sense as to why that narrative is so powerful. And it makes sense as to why people don't want to maybe hear stories about, analysis about, well, when we go back from the end of the war to the origins of the Nazi movement, and when we realize actually the international system helps to create Nazism. And that international system has key decision makers in Washington, in Paris, in London, and that they all play into those systems. They all play into a situation in which French belligerence towards Germany in 1923 weakens German democracy. And so the challenge, I guess, the way to put it for thinking about the history of liberal democracy is, Germany in 1918, following the revolution, declares itself to be a democracy. In 1919, its constitution comes into being. The 11th of August 1919 is the day the constitution comes into being. That's later described by Time magazine in the 1920s as the German 4th of July, the beginning of German democracy. But German democracy at this time is an outlier in the international system, because the international system is dominated by imperialism. It's dominated by British and French imperialism, particularly in Europe and beyond around the world. The United States is not interested in imperialism of the same kind, but America is projecting its power around the world. But it's not yet ready to stand up and say, our goal is to protect and support democracy. That's not the United States' goal in the 1920s. The way the protection of democracy and the ideals of democracy will become something much more important after 1945. So, the world learns from the course of history in the 1930s and 1940s. It hasn't learnt those lessons in 1919, 1920, 1921. And so the Versailles Treaty that's mentioned there, a lot of historians will say, well, Versailles gets a bad reading in history because ultimately the Versailles Treaty is flexible. So the treaty that's agreed for terms of peace is flexible. The amount Germany has to pay in reparations, the treatment of Germany, everything that's in the treaty eventually gets amended, and so it's not set in stone. So a lot of historians will say, because the treaty is not set in stone, we can't blame a treaty that's written in 1919 in the conditions of the war just ending. We can't blame that for what happens after 1930. We can't blame that for the growth and support for Nazism. The story has to be more complicated than that. And those historians all have a point. But the point I tried to make with this book is that the leaders of European capitals and also the leaders in Washington don't draw those conclusions that allow for those changes to happen and for the revision of the Versailles Treaty and for the parts of the Versailles Treaty that weaken the ability of supporters of democracy in Germany to build a democracy. They don't do that until after the crisis of 1923 takes place. So the US attitude at kind of Christmas 1922 towards Germany and France is those two countries are arguing with each other to too great a degree for us to be able to intervene. We've got to let them fight against each other. We've effectively got to let them burn out their dispute, and when they burn out that dispute, we can then return to kind of influencing them to bring about more stability in Europe. So the United States stands back a little bit, and that creates a space in which France can act. And that's where we come to the Ruhr occupation that you mentioned, which is so important. And again, it's one of those points maybe where I'll repeat what you said. If you're listening to this and you're interested in the history of Nazism and where does Hitler come from, maybe one of the things you have never thought about is what was the occupation of the Ruhr in 1923, and maybe we can ask the question, would Hitler have made his breakthrough in the year 1923 without that occupation? What would his politics, how would they have developed? How would the Weimar Republic have developed without the occupation of the Ruhr? It's and we don't talk about it nearly enough. And what the occupation is the Ruhr is a district in Western Germany, where the majority of German coal is mined in the 1920s. It's a really important industrial heartland. It is the heart of the German economy. And it's not occupied by the French in 1919 or 1920. The French and the British and the Americans actually do occupy part of the Rhineland. So they occupy part of Germany closest to the French border from where a German invasion would come in the future if Germany was to try to launch a war against France again. And they do that occupation on the grounds of security. The argument is by putting our troops in that area, Germans can't build up the area militarily, and so we can stop them from invading us again, which from France, from a security perspective, makes sense because France has been invaded by Germany in 1870 and in 1914. So in 1919, 1920, that makes sense from a French perspective to want to have your soldiers on their side of the border, so that if a conflict starts, the destruction and the violence will happen in German territory and not on French territory, as has been the case between 1914 and 1918. But the Ruhr is too far to the east, it's too far away from the Franco-German border, and so there's no justification for occupying it in 1919, 1920. But in 1923, the French Prime Minister, a man called Raymond Poincaré, he decides, I've had enough of Germany, we're going to send our soldiers into the Ruhr. And the reason he does that is, as I've said, France is facing financial and economic challenges, including the reconstruction of the areas of territory that have been destroyed, including paying for it's paying for its war debts, paying money it has borrowed from Britain and from the United States, and France has argued since France's victory that Germany should pay, make the Germans pay. The Germans have to pay us reparations, in other words, compensation for starting the war which we believe they started. And by 1923, Poincaré says, he's reached the point where he thinks that Germany is deliberately mismanaging its economy and lying about its capacity to repay, and so Germany is not paying back France fast enough. Someone like Ratnael openly supported the need for Germany to pay. Lots of German political leaders are openly supporting, saying we are the largest, we run the largest economy in Europe, we should be paying for the reconstruction of Europe. The dispute is not over how much the reparation, not over whether reparations should be paid or not. It's over what rate they should be paid, how much, how quickly, and it's over the moral justification for paying them. Because the Germans never accept the clause of the Versailles Treaty that says that Germany should pay because Germany alone bears responsibility for the start of the war. And nobody in 1920s Germany, apart from a few figures on the very far political left, is willing to accept that. So there's a question of honour at stake on the German side, but on the French side, basically by late 1922, Poincaré is determined to do something. He himself is a really interesting figure. He's French foreign minister before the war starts in 1914. During the war, he's French president, but that's a ceremonial position. And so he doesn't have the power that he would like to have over the course of events between 1914 and 1918. And worst of all, his great political rival, Georges Clemenceau, is the person the French cheer the most as the father of the victory, whereas Poincaré is seen as the father of the war. So Poincaré's diaries and his writings, his comments, he's a really bitter man by the end of the First World War. He's really angry that he's not getting the recognition he feels he deserves, and that his hated opponent, who he openly fantasizes about murdering his political rivals, he is getting the credit for victory. And so Poincaré, once his term as president comes to an end, he gets back and he becomes French prime minister, and he's known as a hawk. So he's a foreign policy hawk. He always preaches a hard line towards Germany. And over the course of 1922, he comes to the conclusion the only way to deal with the Germans is to put soldiers into the Ruhr district and occupy it. Remember, France is Europe's strongest military power at this time. So he's the head of the strongest military power, but he's the head of a country that is not economically as strong as it would like to be, and its economic strength is declining. Remember, France has also seen its coal-producing regions destroyed massively during the war itself. So in an era and a time when coal is the source of energy, it's a really attractive idea for the French. Let's get in and just take the Germans' coal and use that to our advantage, and we'll use the issue of reparations to justify it. And Poincaré's goals over the course of the year continue to change, because he first may be somewhat reluctant, but he becomes more aggressive as the course of events that he unleashes start to spiral and he gets swept away by those events. He no longer controls them, and he becomes more and more aggressive. So over the course of the year, France's goal in the Ruhr, having started as being about getting reparations and sending in a team of engineers to assess how much coal Germany's actually supplying them with, but with 100,000 soldiers to back up that team of engineers to make sure that nothing happens to them, France's goals start to become more and more radical, and those goals move towards the annexation of the Ruhr itself, to make the Ruhr a part of France. And that's an idea today that we might find really hard to get our heads around. The idea that Paris would suddenly say, let's just take on some German territory and make it part of our country. But in the 1920s, that's the way imperial powers acted. That's what imperial states did. They put the flag into a piece of territories and they declared it part of their country. Remember, the late 19th century is also about France, about Paris asserting its rule over the French provinces, about turning peasants into Frenchmen, to use the title of a very famous book. And so claiming the Ruhr for France is not that dramatic a shift in policy from the actions of an imperial state more generally. And it's an extremely attractive one because there's so much economic wealth in that region that not only will France make itself extremely rich, but it will also destroy Germany's economic power. And in the 1920s, if you're a French militarist or nationalist and you hate the Germans, you've already destroyed their military power by victory in the First World War, and now you're going to destroy their other form of German power, its economy. So the Ruhr becomes a really important place for you. And in those conditions, the soldiers who are on the ground have, how much restraint is exercised over their conduct towards the German civilians? How do they act? How do soldiers act when they're confronted with civilians more generally? Militaries across the world do not have a good track record of operating in areas where there's a large civilian population, because that is actually a policing task rather than a military task. And the Army of France after the First World War is not skilled in policing. It is skilled in violence. It is skilled in suppression. And when it faces hostile reactions from the German population, for example, throwing stones, insults, starting fights, refusing to serve Germans in shops and cafes, the local reactions, the small reactions are aggressive. They see fistfights, they see violence, they see retaliation, and the occupying force then engages in more and more acts of reprisal, acts of retaliation, and that creates a cult of martyrdom in Germany amongst the population of the Ruhr. The Ruhr must not be sacrificed. The Ruhr's workers become heroes. The German government response to the occupation is initially to say, we don't know what we're going to do in the first 2 or 3 days, because Germany doesn't have an army. So when France marches into cities like Essen and the soldiers occupy, they parade through the centre of Essen. Germany doesn't have a military option to respond. So instead, the events happen so quickly that they are led from the ground up. And what happens is the leadership in Berlin recognises the workers of the Ruhr are our army. We can't send in the soldiers to fight back, but the workers can fight back. And the workers' best tool for fighting in the 1920s is the strike. Workers can go on strike. Remember, this is a region with really strong tradition of labour unions, really strong tradition of worker independence. And so the workers' movement, which has traditionally been on the left, is now mobilised in defence of the German nation, which creates huge problems for German left social democrats who are left saying, we are mobilising our supporters to do something about defending the nation in a way that we traditionally would not do. And so the workers don't sing the same songs as the right-wing students, but suddenly the Ruhr occupation means that they do, because they're all singing from the same hymn sheet, which is that we've got to do whatever we can to defend Germany against the French aggressor. And so those, shall we call them, structural patterns of the occupation, which see everyday systematic violence towards the civilian population as they're faced with military patrols that are unaccountable to their judicial authorities, where soldiers can do whatever they want. That structure is in place for the year. And alongside that structure, we have then a series of events that put violence on the front of the German newspapers and the front of everybody's minds. And those events can be incidents like occupying soldiers picking a pretty girl at a checkpoint and then taking her away and raping her, which happens and which is documented, takes place. There are gang rapes, there's mass rapes, there's sexual violence, there's permanent threat of sexual violence. And it can be incidents like the shooting of workers in the Krupp Steel Works plants in Essen, when 13 workers are shot dead in a single morning, and that occurs when a group of French soldiers go to the plant to seize vehicles, not weapons. My apologies. To seize vehicles, they want to take trucks away from Krupp Works and commandeer them for the French military, which is part of what occupying armies do. And the workers at Krupp surround the plant, and there's a standoff because the French commander and his men are inside a storage hall with the trucks, and they're surrounded by tens of thousands of angry German workers who are there to protest. And eventually the French commander brings his men out and they open fire on the protesting demonstrators. Not a single French soldier is hurt in any way. And so on the French side, their commander and his men are heroes. On the German side, they are seen as villains. They're seen as having committed an atrocity, and they're seen as being representing the injustice of the French occupation as a whole. And so that threat of violence is ever present during the Ruhr occupation, and it keeps the political climate in Germany hot. So if you think of the question as when did the First World War end? And the answer most people say is November 1918 with the armistice, or June 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles. And we tend to forget that in the course of 1923, the mentalities that these kind of events give rise to are the same mentalities as took place during the war. Ratnael himself, before he was murdered, he said in a speech, the armies of Europe have been demobilized, but the minds have not. And that was the situation in 1923. The occupation of the Ruhr was this great moment of remobilizing the mind, making people in Germany know that they were right to believe that they were right during the war itself, and that they're right to believe in 1923 that Germany is the victim of French imperialism and French aggression. And for historians today, the problem with this is, as you said at the start of the question, we like to think of the Americans and the British and even the French as being the good guys, the victims of Nazi Germany. We don't like to think about what role Paris, London, and Berlin played in undermining Weimar democracy in 1923 and making it really hard for the supporters of democracy and a liberal order to argue against the nationalists in Germany. We don't like to think about how those conditions made it ideal for a man like Hitler to get support and to become a figure of national consequence. We don't like to think about those things because those stories make us feel a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, there's a couple of important things here that I think is worth pointing out. One of the things is, like, I'm really interested from a historical standpoint in ideology and the ways that people see the world. And I think oftentimes it's a lot easier for historians and history teachers to draw lines of demarcation in the years based off of political events, and much more difficult to draw them based off of shifts in ideology and in how people see the world and conceive of it around them. Because one of the things that you pointed out that is really important, I think, and definitely worth digging into, we don't have time today, but that's worth digging into, is this idea that, at least from my perspective, from ideology and the way that politicians and people see the world, 1919 is a lot closer to 1850 than it is to 1950. It's still very couched in this imperialist view of the world, in that, we have to remember, Great Britain and France, I mean, they won the war. They won the war, but they come out absolutely devastated from the conflict. The United States, it pays for the war, but they get paid back at the end. And so the United States winds up in a much, much stronger position after the First World War than it was before. Despite the fact that they won, France and Great Britain do not end up in that same scenario. And that's very different from wars in the past. From wars in the past, if you won, you got something tangible, and your opponent lost something tangible. And you can kind of understand this Ruhr occupation from the French perspective a lot more if you accept that ideology. If you try to see it from hey, this is just going to cause the next World War situation, well, they don't see the world in that way. And so it becomes a lot more difficult to start to understand people, and even being critical from the United States' standpoint is, well, why didn't the United States do something? Well, in the United States, we have this tendency, at least for the last 150 or so years, to go through a periods of about 20 years of intervention, 20 years of isolation, 20 years of intervention, 20 years of isolation. Right now, I think we're about on year 12 or 13 of an isolationist period for those keeping score at home, and I expect that to continue for a little bit here. And then we'll switch. And that's how we do things, for better or for worse. But that I just think that this occupation, because Hitler and other right-wing politicians, they need justification for what they're doing. It doesn't work if you don't have an enemy. All this rhetoric doesn't work if you don't have someone for people to dig their teeth into. And France gives them that. It gives it to them in spades. And yeah, there's the communist left and those sorts of folks that also sort of provide a target. But in terms of an external foe, this notion of, well, we have to avenge what France has done to us and is doing to us is a very powerful narrative. And yeah, I've read historians who do argue, by the way, that there is no true peace treaty after World War I. There's an armistice, there's a pause, and then World War II should really be seen as a continuation of World War I. I don't know how valuable that is, in all honesty, but I've seen it. But by gosh, we've been talking for about an hour. We got to talk about Hitler. let's talk about Hitler a little bit.
Yeah, there's so much there's so much to say there. I mean, the point about tangible benefits, that's really, really important. That's such an important point to make. It's like, Britain wins the First World War, but it feels like it's defeated, right? And if you've ever been in Britain in November, even now, over 100 years after the end of the conflict, it's a solemn ceremony to mark the loss in life. People wear poppies to commemorate those who died and fell in the war. They don't celebrate the victory. And so, France and Britain after the First World War, the one thing that they have, they've lost it in terms of their place, global power. The United States has won that in terms of economic power, but they've won in the terms of their imperial possessions. So the period in history when the British Empire and the French Empire is largest is after 1919, because they get the former territories of the German Empire. And so this idea that, and this is why when you said, 1919 is closer to the 1850s, it's exactly that. They're acting like empires. They've just got lots of imperial power, and they haven't made the mental transition to think, actually, we're economically weak right now, and we need to accept the American leadership and make as many gains as we can from that. They haven't made that jump so far. And so what happens is the occupation of the Ruhr is this imperial power play by France with the support of Belgium, but Belgium is really just following what France tells it to do. Britain stays out, which gives Germany the chance to hope that maybe at some point Britain will switch its position, and Hitler has the stage, because you're right, we've got to come back to it. Hitler has this stage where national passions are being mobilized. People are being called on to sacrifice themselves to defend the Republic. A small number of German men are undertaking covert military operations against the French occupiers. They're planting bombs on trains, which again escalates the situation, because when French soldiers feel they're being shot in the back, they retaliate immediately, and they introduce really harsh punishments against the German civilian population, including, lawyers and doctors in the Ruhr area get mandated to sit on trains to be used as human shields in the event that German saboteurs try and put more bombs onto the train lines. So that's something that the French are doing. It's part of the breakdown in the condition of what it meant to be a civilian, and part of the breakdown of the idea that civilians should be protected from the horrors of war. The food supply situation in the Ruhr is also really bad. Children are starving at a certain point in the spring of 1923. Local charities, local politicians, councils, they start arguing we've got to send the children of the Ruhr out of the Ruhr district, because otherwise they're going to starve to death. And German children do starve in significant numbers. They stop growing normally in the year 1923 because the food situation is so bad. The Quakers actually are the biggest American charity that then comes into Germany, provides lots of soup and lots of nutrition. But the scientific research, the medical research on children's growth in 1923 is very, very clear on this. German children stop growing because they're not being fed properly. And within this environment, Hitler has the stage where he can really turn his rhetoric up and speak about violence. And that's what draws the support to him, because he speaks about violence. In a climate where violence is on everybody's minds, Hitler's message is, don't blame the French for what they're doing. They're just acting as an imperial... He does use the term imperial power. They're treating us like a colony. Hitler's not unique in saying that line at this time. What makes him unique is he says, don't blame the French. You've got to blame Berlin. You've got to blame the Social Democrats in Berlin for this. And above all, you've got to blame the Jews in Germany for creating this climate in which they can do all of this to us, in which we are defenseless. It's the Weimar Republic, and in Hitler's terms, it's Jewish leadership that have betrayed Germany, that have made us so weak that France can treat us in this way. And that's what marks Hitler, makes him unique in terms of the content of his message in 1923, because right from the start of January, he stands out by saying the Social Democrats in Berlin, not France, not Paris, they're the real enemy. They're the enemy that's made us weak. So the internal enemy becomes much more important than the external foe. There's almost even a respect for the external foe, because they are simply acting the way a powerful rival, in the Nazis' terms, racial nation should act. And we're weak because our strength has been sapped from us by our internal enemy, by those Germans who are not really German, which again is the term, that would be a phrase, is the way they would have described Ratnael too, even though that's historically entirely untrue, as we've already said. That's why I talk about Ratnael for so long, because he's actually a real great German patriot, but they are saying he's not really German, he's betrayed us, he doesn't, men like him, Jews like Ratnael, are controlling Germany and making us weak. And that's the rhetoric that attracts people to Hitler in terms of its contents. And in terms of the performance of how Hitler draws supporters to him in the spring in the beer halls of Munich, I mean, it's a really good question for anyone listening to ask, is how does that guy, Mark Jones, know what people thought of Hitler when he was speaking in beer halls and in assemblies in the spring of 1923? And one of the answers to that question is, this guy is saying the Jews are to blame for everything that's gone wrong in Germany. About 1% of the population of Germany in this time is Jewish. And Jewish organizations sent people into those beer halls to record what Hitler was saying and to draw attention to it as a warning. You know, it's one of the most upsetting sets of historical sources that you can read from the 1920s are the newspapers and magazines and publications of Germany's Jewish organizations, which are warning continuously of the dangers that Hitler and that racism and anti-Semitism play to German society. They are sounding the alarm bells, and too few people are listening. And their records about Hitler's speeches in the spring of 1923 are really insightful for how they describe not just the content of what Hitler says, but also the way he performs it, the way his speeches operate. So, you know, we think probably the most famous clip of Hitler watched on YouTube is the end of Downfall, where he's sitting around a table and he's screaming at his other generals. I don't know if that's watched in America as much as in the UK. It's a good thing if it's not, to be honest. It's watched far too much. But this is Hitler the ranter, and we always think of the dictator as ranting into his microphone, you know, his eyes, his frenzy, you know, the man in a state of frenzy, almost a religious ceremony gone wild, and everybody's in a fervor, you know, and everybody's furious, and that rage is what mobilizes them to later do unspeakable things. But that's not the way his speeches work. His speeches take place over a longer period of time. They take place maybe 1 to 2 hours. There are pauses. There's lots of laughter. Hitler's actually a charismatic speaker in terms of making his audience laugh. He pauses to allow them to laugh. At this time, Hitler's not yet a teetotaler, so he stops and he sips his beer and he observes and learns from the crowd. And so when he's saying things, he notes how the crowd reacts to every single verbal threat that he makes. And so there's a learning process, an interactive learning process between him and the crowd. And the observers who were watching these events and appalled by them, they note that he's a very skilled speaker, that he's very skilled at making his audience entertained, enraged, and empowered, all within the same speech, and the duration of that speech. His critics are also fully aware, and the term one social democrat who observes him describes him immediately afterwards and says, "This man is a psychopath." You know, they're fully aware of the danger he possesses, but they recognize that he's a skilled speaker and that he's bringing and growing his movement through those actions. And that's what makes Hitler such a crucial figure, because there are many sects on the political right. We might call them loony brigades, whatever you want to call them, crazies. There are lots of those groups in Weimar Germany in the 1920s. But what gives Hitler a talent is his ability to speak to them all from the one voice and to get them all to join behind his leadership. That's what gives him the talent in the year 1923, and that's what makes him stand out as the single most threatening right-wing leader. And it's because because of his ability to speak and to gain the support and following that makes all of those rival groups row in behind his message. That gives him the power that other rival leaders don't have. Had they had that, Hitler would have stayed as a fringe individual and one of many aspiring right-wing sect leaders. But with him recognised as the sole and most important leader, that's not not possible. And so what he's doing then in the spring of 1923 is he's preaching a message: we need to be violent, we need to prepare for violence, we need to be heroic, we need to get ready to seize power in Germany. And on the 1st of May, it's traditionally a workers' day, he has his first big setback of the year, because on that day he tries to he wants to actually undertake an act of mass violence against workers demonstrating in the city of Munich. The city of Munich, by the way, it's in the state of Bavaria. Bavaria is a very, very right-wing conservative state, but the city of Munich, its capital, has traditionally been quite liberal. So if you think of it as a liberal city in the American Deep South, it's probably the parallel you might use today. You know, in several states in the US, there'll be one city that stands out as being the center point of liberalism in an otherwise conservative area. Munich is a bit like that. And so Hitler promises on the 1st of May 1923 to his followers, we're going to open fire on the socialist demonstrators. He even gets a loan of artillery and weapons for his supporters. They go to the top of a hill. They're overlooking where the socialists are marching. They have the artillery ready. You know, the intensity of that moment is extreme. It's men who are going in to fight to kill or be killed. That's what their expectation is. And Hitler is at the head of that moment, preaching at them, the time has come. But then actually the army who lend him the weapons refuse to allow him to use them, and he has to give them back. And so this moment of mobilization ends with something of a damp squid, and Hitler is really humiliated by that moment of defeat. And in its aftermath, for a number of weeks, he actually leaves Munich, and he is quite probably depressed. And he goes to the mountains of Berchtesgaden, which later becomes his winter retreat, famous residence for Hitler during the Third Reich. Later he claims that this is the point in time in his life when he fell in love with this region. But in the summer, it's the nationalist mobilization against the occupation of the Ruhr that brings him back to Munich and gets him back onto the stage, gets him, if you will, back into the game, because he keeps calling out to Germans that they've got to emulate the heroism of the German nationalists who are defending using violence against the French in the occupation of the Ruhr.
Well, you know, we've talked about a lot of broad things, which I think is good, because I think the context for the rise of Hitler and the rise of Nazism is something that is not as understood as it should be. And it's very well laid out in the book, and there's a lot more in the book that's in there. One of the things that I think also that you did a great job of doing in the book is explaining how you talked about how, you know, France was operating towards the Ruhr, towards Germany, sort of vis-a-vis how France would operate towards a colonial power that it's dominating. And there's a racial component to that, 100% as well, that, you know, this is, hey, we're Europeans, we're not supposed to be colonialized here. Like, this is, you know, not only is this insulting, but it's triple insulting what's happening to us. So he's really doing a great job of building off that rhetoric, and some of those aspects are really important. And I think it's okay that our conversation today focused more on sort of broad idea things rather than like a lot of names and dates, because those can get lost in the shuffle, and those are in the book. But I wanted to close, if we have time, with one last question, because I really did want to ask this question, and it's something that we talked about off the air for a quick second here, and that at the beginning of the book, you cite this statistic that it's in 1919, 75% of the German electorate is in support of some form of liberal democracy. And throughout the course of the 1920s, that number just disappears. And I'm just kind of curious as to what happened. Like how much of this can we say just attribute to Hitler and say, like, well, you know, he did really well in what he was doing, and how much of it could we attribute to external forces, and how much of it do we just not understand?
That's a great question. And I think there'll always be a certain amount that we won't understand. I think we should always say that, like, history is always, there's always a degree of mystery to it. And that said, you know, most people will argue that, you know, the 75% figure comes from the first free elections in Germany in 1919. It's the first time women can vote. And the parties that get that 75% are the Social Democratic Party, the Catholic Centre Party, and Ratnael's party, the Liberal Party, the Democratic German Party. And at the end of Weimar in 1932, in the elections of that year, more than 50% of Germans vote for Hitler's Nazi Party and for the Communist Party, both which are openly committed to the destruction of liberal democracy. And one of the standard answers you will get for this is that, well, Weimar Germany is a weak liberal democracy. It's a republic without republicans, without supporters of democracy. It's a democracy without democrats. It's doomed from the start. And this is the old impression you would get from a lot of older literature, particularly literature written in the 1950s, 60s and 70s even. And one of the reasons that argument was comfortable for everybody in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, whether they be West German or whether they be in the eastern part of Germany under communism, was because it allowed them to present a history of themselves as successors and as successful. So West German historians like the idea that, the 1920s, Germany was not a liberal democracy with any strength, but we are now. We are better than the Germany that existed in the 1920s. So Bonn, the Republic of Bonn, when Germany was divided, that was the capital of West Germany. It's the successful Germany. Bonn is not Weimar, was a phrase that was used an awful lot. In the eastern part of Germany, the answer was East Germany has succeeded where communism in the 1920s failed. So we've created what should have happened in the 1920s, a successful communist state. And then beyond Germany itself, the idea was, Nazism is a product of the world economic crisis. We've spoken already, we don't want to remember too much the role played by Britain and the United States and France in undermining German democracy at the point of its foundation in the early 1920s. And the standard answer that echoes right down into today is then that Weimar lost support because the Republic was weak. And then when the world economic crisis happened following the crash of 1929, which really hits Germany in 1930, that was what finished off the Republic. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is because I don't believe those arguments. I think what we see in 1923 is a chance to compare how the democracy performed under crisis and to compare that with what happens in 1932 and 1933. And in 1923, German democracy, it faces the occupation of its industrial heartland. I've mentioned the children are starving, the humiliation, the threat to women's bodies, the racial humiliation you've mentioned as well. All of these points are really important. There's an economic disaster which comes in the form of hyperinflation, because to fund the shutting down of the Ruhr and the striking, the German central bank prints notes and prints money. As you've got this hyperinflation, the currency of Germany becomes worthless. And in the summer, people can't buy food because you can't buy food if you've got no money to pay for it, and because the money's no longer functioning or working. And so people are losing their entire life savings overnight. There's anger in society. People are hungry. Hitler's not the only radical getting support. But everything that's happening at that point in time says if this democracy is weak and there are no Democrats, it should collapse. Hitler's Putsch should succeed. It should be like Mussolini's. It should end successfully with Hitler in Berlin becoming German Chancellor. The German army should be siding with the Nazis and marching against the state. Remember, the Reichswehr and the army in the 1920s is not a fully pro-Republican, pro-democratic Weimar force. The communists in their strong states like Thuringen and Saxony should be able to seize power. They have enough support. They should be able to try to launch their German Red October. So all the threats to Weimar democracy's existence that are there, that are benefiting from this crisis, that hits its strongest point in the late autumn, and the point I call now or never moments in the book. So this is if you want to destroy Weimar Germany, this is when the condition is best for you. It's now or never. In that point in time, the democracy stands up to all of its threats. The leaders of democracy are able to mobilize their supporters, and at the end of the year, they're the ones who are victorious. And when they look back at December on the course of 1923, they see how close their republic has come to failing, but also they see how it has stood tall. And that's possible because there's a much stronger tradition supporting democracy in Germany than people are willing to give credit to in that older literature that I've spoken about. And so this is the first thing that has to be said about answering this question is the democracy in Weimar is much stronger than we're willing to give it credit for. That's one of the reasons why Hitler's Putsch doesn't get the allies that Hitler thinks in November when he wants the soldiers of the army to march with him. The army's commanders have turned their back on this idea because they know if they move against Berlin, they know that the Social Democrats who support democracy in Berlin will mobilize more ex-soldiers who are supporters of the Social Democratic Party than they have in their army. They know that they'll lose a fight. There's a risk that Germany will come to an open civil war in the autumn of 1923, and that doesn't happen because of pacifism on the part of military commanders. It happens because those military commanders make a strategic choice, which is, we're not going to fight now because we'll lose. And the reason they'll lose is because the strength of democracy is there to stand up to them. And so this is the important point that needs to be made, is that the democracy is strong. And then to come back to the question is, what erodes it? What erodes a democratic system that can survive the challenges of 1923, but not survive those of 1932-33? And one of the answers to that is the world economic crisis produces mass unemployment, weakens the left. That happens, and that's undoubtedly part of the answer. But there's more to it than that. One issue is that the leadership that was dynamic and strong in supporting democracy in 1923 is a decade older by 1932-33, and it's just lost some of its force, it's lost some of its ability to fight back, and it has become too conservative in the way it thinks about how we should fight back to defend the democracy. So in the summer of 1932, when the Nazis and conservatives go against the government of the state of Prussia, the largest state in the Weimar system, also the most pro-democratic state, the response of the SPD leadership is to go to the courts and to try to defend the constitution constitutionally in the courts, which is too slow, too little, too late. It needed to be defended out on the streets. But again, that's hindsight makes that maybe an easy criticism to make. At the time, they underestimated the degree of brutality to which Hitler was prepared to engage in. One of the reasons they underestimated is they simply didn't want to confront what was in front of their eyes because it was so terrible, and it's easy to bury your head in the sands in a crisis. So that's part of the answer. But one of the things that made it, that has to be said alongside it, is that there is an erosion of trust in the democracy among elites, and there are significant members of the political elite who decide by the end of who've never really loved Weimar Germany, and who decide in the 1930, 31, 32, we're going to use this crisis to destroy this republic. And those elites, their loyalty to the republic has been eroded gradually over time between 23 and 29, 30. And so what you see is there's a progressive elimination of support for democracy on a much smaller scale than these major events that happen later on, like the coup against the Prussian government in 1932. And what I would always say to my colleague historians when we talk about the significance of the world economic crisis is that 1929 is the 10th anniversary of the foundation of the Weimar Republic. And that's an anniversary moment, even before the world economic crisis is a thing, before it's taken place. That leads to a taking stock. What happened in the last 10 years? You talked earlier about, American foreign policy has this shift of every 20 years it goes in a different direction. And that's because as each decade passes, people look at themselves and say, what happened in the last decade? It's a way of measuring time, measuring progress, measuring success, measuring failure. And in 1929, Germans look at the Republic, lots of them, and say, this Republic hasn't delivered. It hasn't given us what we want. There's so much disappointment among supporters of the Republic and anger among opponents of the Republic. And they look back at the Versailles Treaty and say, this has been 10 years of this treaty, this regime. And at this point in time, Hitler gets platformed. A group of conservative politicians, one of whom is a newspaper baron controlling large amount of media, brings Hitler into the fold and puts him on the same stage as respected conservative speakers. And they're campaigning against something called the Young Plan, which is an economic plan that follows on from the Dawes Plan, which is about giving loans to Germany to maintain Weimar's financial stability. And that gives Hitler a chance to present himself as no longer being the failed putschist of 1923, no longer being, let's call it kind of simplistically or plain speaking, no longer being the idiot who tried to seize power with 2,000 men in November and failed after 20 hours, but it becomes a respectable potential states leader, significant figure, because he gets that platform. And that's happening, and his vote, as a consequence, is increasing before the world economic crisis takes place. And so that's what I think the key to answering this question as to what happens in those intervening years is that there's a gradual erosion of support for democracy, because democracy isn't able to show that it's delivered sufficiently, and too many members of the elite start to think we'll succeed in the next crisis where we failed in the last one, and we'll use it to destroy the democracy. It's not actually about an inherent weakness that's present from 1919 to 1933. It's actually that the history of Weimar, when we look at it in more detail, shows us that the history of democracy in Germany depends upon an ongoing battle between those who support it and those who oppose it. And at certain points in time, those who support the democratic system have the upper hand, and certain points in time, those who oppose it have the upper hand. And in 1932 and early 1933, those who oppose it have the upper hand to the degree that they're able to destroy it.
And I think there's the book in many ways, I think, is important, and it does offer as sort of a warning, a cautionary tale in many, many ways, because I think it's what you point out there is really crucial for people to take away, in that the Weimar Republic wasn't inherently weak. Yes, there were a lot of national and international factors here at play that made the collapse of a government more likely, but by no means guaranteed it. And I mean, we didn't even get into really the talk about the currency and the shift from the gold standard and so on and so forth, but that's all in the book too. And that's probably something people are more familiar with, but it's a cautionary tale in that, again, getting back to those archetypes of history that we sometimes buy into. And one of the ones that we buy into a lot is the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, i.e., if something falls, it must have a lengthy, steady decline. That's not necessarily true. The reality is we had a relatively healthy, functioning political system in Germany in 1923, and we still had one in 1930. But there's this problem that I think is inherent in a lot of democracies, which is, I call it the disillusionment factor. If you think of the people who are disillusioned with their democracy gets over a certain level, then you start to move into what you call a code red, where no longer do you have a 50-50 fight between supporters of democracy and supporters and anti-democracy people. Once that number starts to shift, things can get problematic very, very quickly. And the changes that we're talking about are oftentimes small things that you don't notice from years and years prior. It's not always the big things. It's not, Hitler's efforts to take over Prussia and so on and so forth. There's a lot of small things that happen before then, and opportunities when Hitler could have been checked, and sometimes when he was. I mean, after all, someone almost shot him in 1923. There are times when he was, but it's things that you have to be leery about. So, okay, well, we've gone way over time, but that's okay. It's a wonderful conversation, and I really enjoyed the topic. It's a great book. We talked a lot, but there's still so much in here that we haven't had an opportunity to touch on. So I truly hope that people stop and pick up the book and enjoy it, and I'm sure it's going to do very, very well. And thanks for coming on, of course.
Thank you so much, Adam. Really appreciate that. And I hope that people who read the book will get an indication of whether I think we're at a code red right now or not.